This is not the first Turkish empire, despite that being the title of this lecture on your coursebook, because we've had previous Turkish empires. This is perhaps the first major Turkish empire of the Islamic world. And it sets a precedence, not just in terms of the entry of the Turks into Muslim politics and Muslim sovereignty, but rather in terms of setting a cultural and social and political kind of structure in place that is very long-lasting. You see it last through centuries, all the way up until, I would say, the establishment of the nation-state in the early 20th century. You see it in the Ottoman world, you see it in the Safavid world, you see it in the Mughals in India. But before we launch into discussing the Seljuks, we have to recap what's going on in the Middle East, what's going on in the Islamic world on the eve of the Seljuk arrival. On the eve of the Seljuk arrival, if you recall, there is one great power in the Islamic East, and that's the Ghaznavid power. The Ghaznavids were essentially a Perso-Indian empire based around Ghazni, the capital. You can kind of see it there. Where is Ghazni? It's quite near Kabul. It's in eastern Afghanistan. Right there. Ghazni, smack bang in the middle. Just go further up from Kandahar. That is the Imperial heartland. And that is the pivot upon which the two wings of the Ghaznavid Empire, the Khorasani Persian wing, and then the left wing, the Hindu Indian wing of the empire, pivot around. It's a remarkably wealthy and a remarkably powerful empire. They give nominal homage to Baghdad. On their coins, you see the name of the caliph, but nonetheless, this is an empire within its own right. In this period, however, as you enter into the 10th century, there are environmental changes afoot, globally speaking. On the steppe, well above this, on the Eurasian steppe, there is a cold, and in that cold, all of these flocks are pushed further and further south in search of warmer climes. They cannot sustain their flocks on the steppe, and these predominantly Turcoman nomads migrate from the steppe further and further south in search of suitable pastures in warmer climes that can sustain life. This causes a wave of migration by these nomadic hordes into the Islamic world. At the same time, of course, this cold is something that does what? What would happen to all of these Iranian lands in the Islamic East?
Become less agriculturally productive.
Yes. And in turn, what would that cause?
Decrease of wealth, probably inability to pay the army.
Very good.
Famine as well.
Yes. So there are a host of administrative, financial, as well as really demographic challenges that are faced by the settled world of the Iranian and Islamic East, while at the same time there is an influx of nomadic hordes from the north. Now, the Karakhanids, that is this red dotted empire to the north that's really based around Transoxiana, it's very good at funneling all of these nomadic hordes further and further south. They come and they swear fealty to the Karakhanate Khan, and the Karakhanate Khan looks down south to its old rival in the Ghaznavids and unleashes all of these Turcoman hordes onto their territory as, well, one, to get rid of them because they pose a threat if they linger around his imperial dominion, and two, to really weaken his enemy down south. When I said the Seljuk Turks are not the first empire, They're not the first Muslim Turkish empire, because the Ghaznavids really, even though they don't describe themselves as a Turkic empire, they come from a Turkic Mamluk background. They come from, despite all of their grandiose claims to be descended from various Persianate, heroic and royal figures, they came from a Turkish slave corps background themselves. But even before the rise of Islam, in antiquity, you have the Göktürk Empire. What is the Göktürk or Blue Turk Empire? Or as they themselves call themselves, the On-Ok people, the 10 Arrow people. It's a steppe empire of antiquity. How is it organized? Typically, nomadic empires are not terribly centralized. Why? It's difficult to have a bureaucracy that is keeping track of mobile assets, assets that are constantly in the move and are also constantly in flux. So not only are all of these flocks and peoples in really quite an expansive territory moving around, when they go to a warmer climate, they might expand. You might have your flock grow all of a sudden very rapidly, very quickly. And then one harsh winter, the flock, again, kind of recedes. Whereas agrarian peoples, they are settled on a fixed territory. There are land surveyors that can come in and have a pretty good idea of what assets are in what corner and how much tax to assign them. Furthermore, agrarian people, peasants, these are not armed bands. These are people who are armed at best with pitchforks. They're not going to pose a threat. You can tax them quite easily. This is not the case with a nomadic population. Each nomad is a horseman. And not just a horseman, but a warrior horseman. He is a raider as well as a horseman. He is herding his flock and at the same time guarding his flock. He's not going to be too amenable to being told exactly what to do. You have to rule with a relatively light touch. And the Turkic tradition, the steppe tradition, really divides the empire into the West Wing and the East Wing. It reflects the decentralized nature of the rule. And the ruling clan really divvies up these resources on the steppe between the members of the ruling household. It's not what you have in the Sasanian or Roman world, where the emperor is the central figure and all authority, ideally and many times almost practically, are concentrated in his hand. He appoints governors, he tells them what to do. This is much less the case in the steppe tradition of the Imperial Turks. For them, it's a patrimonial family affair. It is the entirety of the family that get to have a say. They are co-rulers almost in a wide-ranging confederation that covers a great deal of territory, mobile resources, autonomous and unruly herdsmen who are constantly in move and quite, well, I hesitate to say entrepreneurial, but they're enterprising individuals. If they're leading a raid somewhere in the corner of the empire, it's not necessarily because the Khans know about this, let alone have authenticated it and approved such a raid. So you have a much more fluid system of rule. You have a much more turbulent political system. It's not just one man with a centralized bureaucracy. It's one extended clan and family spread across a vast dominion. And even ideologically, they themselves kind of reflect this decentralized mode of living and imperial authority, with a West Wing and an East Wing. So what happens when the Seljuks do come down to the Iranian plateau, into Khorasan, into the Islamic East? There are two brothers, two Seljuk brothers. These very enterprising, very ambitious individuals who are guiding their flocks further and further south. And the two main characters to think of here are the two brothers, Tughrul and Tughrul. So what do Tughrul and Tughrul get up to? They draw on the strengths of their nomadic army in comparison with the settled Ghaznavid army. The Ghaznavid army, it's very good at fighting, well, what you and I would think of as conventional forces. People in heavy armor who draw up in battle lines, move relatively slowly. It's composed largely of infantry, backed up with heavy cavalry, and increasingly, since the conquest of India, heavily ironclad elephants. All of this slow-moving, sure-footed juggernaut of a conventional force. It comes up against lightly armed cavalry that are fighting pretty much from a distance. These nomadic horsemen are very good at raiding and not so much at pitched battles. And Tughrul and Tughrul, Tughrul especially, is a militarily gifted commander. He recognizes that if he fights the Ghaznavids in a pitched battle, he is not going to win. His lightly armored force is going to be ground down and destroyed. So he constantly lures them further and further away from their supplies. Then he circles around and poisons the wells. Then he keeps raiding them during the night. He doesn't really close with them, but he constantly harasses them. And after months and months of frustrating pursuit, the Ghaznavid army is tired. And it's becoming, at the same time, more and more complacent, thinking that the Seljuk army, the Turcoman army, is not really ever going to close. They might come and harry you, they might come and rustle a few sheep and goats and camels in your camel train, baggage train, but really there isn't going to be much fighting. The more spread out they become, the more tired they become, the more worn down in the campaign they become, the more Tughrul and Tughrul think this is perhaps the time to strike the decisive blow. And eventually, this is precisely what happens. They manage to deal a very, very heavy defeat on the Ghaznavids. And the Ghaznavids are thrown out of Khorasan, and they really have to retreat to North India, the Punjab. And that becomes their base of retrenchment. And here already you have Tughrul take over the eastern part, the Khorasani part of the empire. And that becomes the east wing of the empire under his control. For him, he's concentrating on pursuing the Ghaznavids well into India. The lesser part of the empire, the kind of northern Iran, that is given over to the brother Tughrul. And he has pretty much the lesser part of the empire. He has the rump compared to Tughrul's much bigger dominion. So we should also at this point think that these are two enterprising brothers who are leading their own bands and their own patrimonial kind of circles into more and more territories to conquer. But as I said, it's a whole collective of Turcoman tribes and clans that are moving with them. They might be the overall leader, but really the leadership is shaky. Many tribes are just striking out on their own and going on their own raids. They don't sit down with Tughrul or Tughrul to consult with them. Do you think it's okay for me and my tribe to go in this direction? They see opportunity and they might consult with another Turkmen emir and say, perhaps this is the time that we can strike out on our own, before the rest of these Turkmen go to this, that, or the other province in Persia and pick out these rich, untouched, unfettered kind of resources, slaves, populations to raid. We have to get there first. So actually what happens is that these Turcoman emirs, they're expanding autonomously. And Chagri and Tughrul are really following up in many cases. This is an essentially organized conquest of the Islamic world. This is a migratory pattern of Turcoman raiders, autonomously in many cases, pushing further and further in, looking for ideal places to raid. And then Chagri and Tughrul trying to follow up and trying to establish some kind of permanent authority in these places, to turn a land that is being constantly raided by a previous wave of Turkmen kind of tribes into a new part of an empire. Tughrul, he's not like Chagri. Chagri is very much a military-minded and kind of martial figure. Tughrul is more of a diplomat on horseback. And he's culturally and intellectually curious. He understands the kind of Turkmen steppe tradition that he comes from, but he also realizes its limitations. And he's coming into contact with these Persianate viziers and this culture that offers him a very distinct notion of political authority. The idea of centralized control, of a shahanshah overseeing a group of viziers who control a rationalized bureaucracy that is not based on a raiding economy, but is based on regular and rationalized taxation. And this really appeals to him. He sees through this model a way for himself and his kind of inner circle of elites to acculturate into a Persianate tradition of settled imperial power, and to really ground his power in an otherwise very tumultuous and turbulent steppe polity. And what you have is that he's increasingly attempting to bring in these Persianate poets, viziers, bureaucrats, all of these people that he finds useful in setting down roots in this settled economy and administration. There are cultural aspects to this as well as the administrative. There is a vizier, al-Kunduri, who comes from an Arab Khorasani background that becomes his right-hand man. And al-Kunduri is very much his consigliere, his advisor, and is able to translate for him into Arabic and Persian, because Tughrul can only really speak his native Turkish, and to bind him to this new administration that al-Kunduri is setting up for him as some kind of a new shahanshah, this royal figure, not just a khan, not just the head of a raiding party, but something much more grander, something that has a permanent and concrete claim to power. And once he enters into Isfahan, there is a network of patronage that has opened up to local Persian poets, because there is a need now to articulate oneself as a Persianate ruler. There is a need now to become something more than this Turkmen barbarian raider from beyond the periphery. It needs to be made intelligible and acceptable to the Persian-speaking elites in places like Isfahan, all of these major urban centers of this new burgeoning empire. I think one of the more fascinating sets of sources that one can look at are the Persian divans and Persian narrative verse that is commissioned under Seljuk patronage. One of these is given to Farrokhi Gorgani, and Gorgani is an able poet that converts this old incestuous love story from Iran's pre-Islamic past into a very Islamicate, halal, non-incestuous love story in verse for his Seljuk patrons. Most people and most scholars who deal with Visuramin, this story, they deal with it from a literary perspective. But before you get to the story itself, it's prefaced by a panegyric, kind of a praise by the poet of not just al-Tughrul, but also of his vizier, al-Kunduri. And I think in that panegyric, which will be read out aloud in court circles, you find how these new Seljuks are being described to the Persian elites in Isfahan. In that panegyric, in that preface, you have a poem praising and really situating Abu Tughrul culturally for his audience. Abu Talib Tughrul, the supreme Shahanshah, lord over the lords of the world. He dawned from the east like the sun. His fortune made him the Shahanshah like Jamshid. Again, Jamshid, the Shahname's quintessential universal ruler. If you read tales of the Sasanians or the chronicles of the Samanians, you only need to read the history of this sultan once, referring to Tughrul, and all other annals will appear undistinguished. He journeyed from Turan to Iran. He crossed the Oxus like Khosrow. Here you have a strange acknowledgement of he's coming from Turan to Iran. There is a foreignness to him, but nonetheless, he crossed the Oxus like Khosrow. Khosrow is an old legendary king that was in exile in Tehran and then returned back to Iran. There is this notion of oddly Iranianizing him, kind of making him native, taking away somewhat from the foreignness culturally of Tughrul in order to ingratiate him to these Persian elites. There is also a panegyric for al-Kunduri, the vizier himself, because he's also praised after Tughrul. He speaks in Persian, Arabic, and Turkish, in words that rejuvenate the soul. He has two swords. One is from steel, the other from discourse. One is wielded by his hand, the other by his tongue. This notion that to hold authority, one has to engage in both military action, the sword, as well as bureaucratic, administrative action, the qalam, the pen. And this is a recurring theme in this period. The notion that imperial authority is defined by the Ahlul Sayf, the people of the sword, as well as the Ahlul Qalam, the bureaucratic class. These two classes of really imperial servants are the two columns upon which an imperial state is crafted. The people of the sword, Ahlul Sayf, and Ahlul Qalam, the people of the pen. Your Persian bureaucrats, or at least your Persian-speaking bureaucrats, not all of them were in terms of lineage Persian, and the Turk element. Overwhelmingly, but not exclusively, of course, people who were generals, who were officers would be the wrong terms, but the emirs, the raiders, the military men. But also recognize that there's now a new element. So on Monday, we talked about how it wasn't either Arab or Persian, but it was Arab and Persian. In order to be a cultured, sophisticated person who was really had a claim to being a part of the elite, had a claim to being a sophisticated literati, he would not only be engaging in Arabic, but also with Persian. Now it's changed. There is an additional third element. He speaks in Persian, Arabic, and Turkish. Al-Kunduri, the Grand Vizier here, is marrying three different traditions and literary kinds of discourse into one integrated art, adab, sophistication, etiquette. Of course, he commissions various works, Al-Kunduri, in order to legitimate the new coming of the Turks. And one of the works that he commissions is the Tafzil al-Atrak, the superiority of the Turks over other armies. And in this work, it's kind of presented as preordained that the Turks would come and rule over the Muslim world. God created them in the likeness of lions with broad faces and snub noses, well-rounded limbs and irascible disposition. They are accustomed to deserts and steppes, are patient in the face of want and difficulty, and they consider a carefree life to consist of raiding. There is a lionization of them as raiders. Yes?
Is it written in Arabic or Persian?
It's written in Arabic, the Tafsir al-Atrak. And it's really written for Iraqi elites that were predominantly Arab-speaking in order to legitimate to them these upstart Turks taking over imperial authority and really making the caliph give them, rather than the Buyids and these other Persian generals, the title of Amir al-Umara. They are going to have to justify why they're displacing those and forming a new kind of state. And here you have the Turco-Tajik element. The Turco-Tajik element, it really kind of corresponds again to the Ahl al-Sayf and the Ahl al-Qalam, the people of the sword and the people of the pen. The Turk element, and this isn't really to be interpreted in an ethnic manner, the Turk element is the military element, while the Tajik element is the bureaucratic, civilian, administrative element. Yes?
Of course, in Persian literature, you can see the words, the military terms like Kushul are Turkish.
That's a very good point. Even to this day, a lot of military and even non-military, but things that have military origin, like Ordu.
Yeah.
What is Ordu in modern Persian? Camp. But it comes from the Turco-Mongol term.
Yeah.
Many other things, like it used to be more common, but Barangar and Jarangar, the right and the left, this refers to the right and the left wing of the army. So many other terms, Yüzbaşı, literally in Turkish means the head of 100. Minbashi, the head of 1,000. Military administration is predominantly Turkic. Even though many people might come up who become generals and they come from non-Turkic stock, nonetheless, culturally, in terms of a cultural ideal, the Turk is regarded as that martial, courageous military element, and the Tajik, even though you might come from Turkic stock sometimes, the Tajik element represents the non-military, the civilian, the soft, bureaucratic, sophisticated administrator. And the art of Seljuk statehood is marrying these two arms and harmonizing them under one sultanic authority. How is that sultanic authority expressed? It's not fundamentally different from what has come before. There are continuities. Tughrul is, remember, he's acculturating into the Perso-Islamic model of kingship. So he's taking up a lot of things that we've already seen. Remember these coins? These kinds of coins, I think I showed them to you in week 3. I'm not expecting you, of course, to read any of the script, but recognize there's a symbol. Yes? The bow and arrow. So you have things that the Buyids and the other emirs who had kind of wrested de facto control from the caliphs already were using. Shah and Shah.
Does it say Malik al-Muluk?
Yes. So you have both the Arabic, king over kings, as well as the Persian, Shah and Shah, as well as, of course, Al-Qa'im bil Amrillah, the name of the caliph, alongside the name of Abu Tughrul, Abu Talib al-Tughrul. But above all of these, the new element, the third element, is introduced as well. So you have the Persianate, you have the Arabic, and now into this bilinear discourse, you have the third element. It becomes a trilinear discourse, the Turkic steppe tradition. Because all of these nomads, they might not be able to read and write, but these Turcoman emirs can nonetheless see on the royal mint that there is a bow and arrow representing the Khaqanic, the great Khan's authority. And in rituals, we know from literary sources that if you want to hold council, if you want to present yourself to your emirs, to your viziers, as the Seljuk Sultan, you appear with a bow and arrow. That bow and arrow is very much central to the ritualistic kind of element of your power. That bow and arrow represents in the minds of your Turkmen emirs and your steppe kind of origin subjects that you are the imperial authority. You have Malik ul-Muluk, you have Khaqan, and you have Shahanshah. The Turkic, the Persianate, as well as the Arabo-Islamic elements are fused and integrated together. You can see the increasing diversity of the Ummah. You can see how it's becoming less and less homogeneous as these centuries go by. More and more heterogeneous elements are introduced.
But I guess even when there's an introduction of many different elements, there's still sort of, I guess you could say, three major literary languages.
Right.
That's Arabic and Persian, and to a lesser extent Turkish, in which, for example, if you're an Indian Muslim, you would write in Persian. And the same could be said of a Persian or a Central Asian Turk, and Arabic, of course, the writers from Malaysia, etc. So there's still kind of a unity through literature and language.
Precisely. These are lingua francas. These aren't really ethnic languages in the way that we think of languages being today. They're not really tied to any kind of national community or anything. Really, a lot of people who are speaking these languages, they, in terms of their ethno-linguistic background, have nothing to do with these languages. These languages tie together various communities all across the Islamic East. So if you want to be a bureaucrat, you might not come from a Persian background in that Persian in this kind of time setting was not an ethnic or national kind of identity to begin with. Persian was primarily a lingua franca of the elites who were engaged in high literature and imperial bureaucracy. And Arabic also ties together many, many people who are, in terms of their origin, not Arabic. Turkic is an oral language. That's why you don't see it in the literature as much. And we have to be careful because you and I, as historians, we mostly deal with what kind of sources? Sources that are written down, literary sources, documentary sources. The oral tradition is largely lost to us, and that's why we might get the mistaken impression that, well, Turkish was not as prevalent. No, it was very much prevalent. When the council meets and the emirs are speaking and discussing a course of action for a campaign or what have you, they are discussing it almost certainly with the Sultan in Turkish. But when it comes to writing down the decree, the edict, which explains and records it, they might do it in Arabic or Persian. And for you and I as historians, what remains? It's the Arabic and Persian. But the Turkic element is very, very important. And you see kind of vestiges of this, clues to this, in how al-Kunduri is praised. He speaks in Persian, Arabic, and Turkish. So eventually, you have Tughrul arriving in Baghdad. Not only does he consolidate control over central Iran, the Iranian plateau, he goes up north to the Caucasus and into Armenia in what is kind of Kurdistan, and he goes down to the big city, the caliphal capital. And there, he's able to consolidate control over a territory that really kind of dwarfs Chagri's dominions in the east. He started out with the rump of the empire, and now he's ended up with really the more important part. While Chagri is bogged down fighting with the Ghaznavids in the east, Tughrul has been having a very good time of it, very easily expanding further and further into the Iranian plateau. And of course, he's following on, as I said, these Turkmen raids, because as a Turkmen emir, what do you want to do? You don't want to live and have your flocks settle in a territory where the Shahanshah, as now he's calling himself, Tughrul, has given amnesty to all the locals. Because you can't raid them. Primarily, you're looking for new avenues and new victims, really, that have no protection. Or if they have protection, it's someone that you can overcome, overthrow, kill, take his stuff, and then go after his subjects and take all of their stuff. You're constantly having these Turcoman emirs come to a new province, raid, rape, pillage, have the time of their lives, and then Tughrul shows up and goes to all of these elites and says, oh my dear, what have the Turcoman emirs been doing here? I can't believe they would be like this. I'm so sorry. There's only one solution here, of course. We have to have a Shahanshah figure that guarantees peace, stability, tranquility, to impart justice. And what are you going to do as a local elite? You're stuck between a rock and a hard place, because you have these Turcoman emirs who are absolutely crazy. They want to destroy you and take everything that you have. And then you have this slimy, very astute politician come up to you and say, it's either them or it's me. I'm going to take your money, but at least your life and your property are going to be guaranteed under my stable rule. Every year, my tax officials will come and they will take a cut. So do you want to pay the cut? Do you want to bend the knee? Because if you do, Bismillah, welcome to the empire. If you don't, then I'm afraid these terrible Turcoman emirs, they're completely out of control, aren't they? You're going to have to deal with them. So this is kind of a very thuggish expansion that is being experienced here. And what you have is the Turcoman emirs constantly getting angry with Tughrul, saying that we were having a great deal of fun in Armenia. We were having a great deal of fun in Diyarbakir. And then Tughrul showed up, and it's no longer fun. Where do we have to go to get this guy off our back? With all of his stupid notions, gone native notions of peace, Shahanshahik authority, we don't want this. They are constantly fleeing from under Tughrul's rule in order to grab more territories for themselves where they can let loose their herds, where they can let loose all of their Turkmen raiders. And eventually, they are caught up with. And there isn't much more raiding and expanding that they can do. They kind of come to be crushed in terms of their freedom of movement under this new Shahanshahik empire that Tughrul has constructed, with more and more of these major rich urban environments given amnesty and protection by him. And the resentment starts to grow. The resentment starts to grow considerably. These Turcoman emirs do not like the local settled inhabitants. They view them as the former victims of yesterday. They hold them in very low regard. And of course, this is reciprocated. The settled populations in places like Baghdad look at these Turkmens as little more than uncouth barbarians, people who are bloodthirsty, violent, and unsophisticated. And eventually, this kind of powder keg of resentment finds its spark. And that spark is a dispute in the bazaars of Baghdad between a Turkmen and one of the local market holders. And that spark causes a Turkmen uprising and a sack of the city, and then a fight against Tughrul. Because Tughrul is, remember, the person who is trying to preserve and give amnesty to these local populations, because they have now become his subject. This is not acceptable for the Turkmens anymore. He starts fighting the Turkmens, and the Turkmen emirs, under all of this pressure, bound together and fight against Tughrul and manage to defeat him. Tughrul has to retreat. Tughrul has to retreat all the way to his old city of Rey. So he has pretty much lost all of his recent expansions and all of his recent acquisitions across the Islamic world. And he's on the back foot. And then that's when Chagri's sons look to their uncle and think, this is a very old man. He has no heirs, we should help him. Because what does that mean? What does that mean?
That when he dies, they might get some of his territory.
Yeah, they think, oh, uncle, I can't believe that these terrible Turcoman emirs have rebelled against you. How dare they? We're going to help you out. We're going to make sure you get back the entirety of your empire, that big, beautiful, rich, populous lands that you have, because that's yours, meaning in a few years when you die, it's mine. And Alp Arslan and his brothers come westwards, and they bring with them a remarkably astute and ingenious bureaucrat, a Persian bureaucrat, who is given the title Nizam ul-Mulk. Nizam ul-Mulk will write one of the most influential texts in not just political thought, but also it's one of the greats of the Mirror for Princes genre. It really sets down the ideals of Islamic governance for many centuries to come. And a partnership is kind of implied here. You see all of these major Seljuk Turkmen emirs come onto the scene, but they are always accompanied by the bureaucrat on their right shoulder. So with Tughrul, it was Al-Kunduri. Now with Alp Arslan, it's this guy Nizam ul-Mulk. And you have even phrases that are recorded in some dictionaries in this period. Başsız bork bolmaz, tatsız Turk bolmaz. Just as a head without a cap makes no sense, a Turk without a Tajik makes no sense. The idea that Turk and Tajik are necessarily two components of an integrated whole. They cannot exist independently.
In especially, notably, Rumi's poetry, the theme of the Turk and Tajik is a sort of repeating theme.
Right, and actually in Rumi's poetry, you see that kind of the cultural element of the Turk and Tajik. The idea that Turk doesn't actually refer to an ethnicity or a group of people per se, but being Turk is being courageous, it's being martial, it's being direct and without fear. And being Tajik, what does it mean to be a Tajik? It means to be considered, it means to be calm, it means to be soft and reflective. These are the two modes that are supposed to be complementary. You are supposed to embody both of them as a sophisticated and well-balanced, cultured individual. So, inevitably, because, as we pointed out, there is no primogeniture in this political system, there is just what you and I would think of as a free-for-all. So the main guy dies, and now anyone in the extended clan of the Seljuks has a right to try and assert himself, has a right to try and grab the reins of power. And that is entirely legitimate. That is not a usurpation of power. In the Turkmen political mindset, it's in fact necessary for the person who becomes the Khagan to demonstrate through a battle, a rivalry, a civil war against his competitors that he has the right, the God-given right, to sit on the throne. Because who determines who wins in a civil war? In the mindset of these elites, it's God. It's God-given glory. And Alp Arslan is very good at binding these Turkmen emirs under his control and leading raids, leading not just raids, but major military campaigns, conquests into the Caucasus, into eastern Anatolia, and manages to defeat the Byzantine emperor in the Battle of Manzikert, which is to this day a very big part of the national imagining of Turkey. There's also his war against the East. So remember, the Karakhanids, they were funneling all of these Turkmen hordes and nomads through their lands in order to get them out and onto the Iranian plateau, to really unleash them on the Ghaznavid enemy south of the Oxus. This works for them very well, but eventually these Seljuks build up a remarkable coalition of Turkmen forces and think to themselves, we no longer have to be merely allied or neutral towards the Karakhanids. We can incorporate the Karakhanids into our empire as well. We can unite Iran and Turan to really lay claim and give meaning to this title that the Caliph has given us. Because the Caliph has given us Malik al-Muluk, but also Malik al-Mashriq wal-Maghrib, king over the west and the east. This kind of reflects the two wings of the empire. And for Tughrul, he thinks that, well, maybe the other wing of the empire can be the Karakhanid wing. Let us go there, and pretty soon the Karakhanid Khan gives him the perfect casus belli. The Karakhanid Khan is actually bound to the Seljuk family through marriage. Alp Arslan's sister is given to the Karakhanid ruler, and the Karakhanid ruler gets into an argument with his wife and beats his wife. Alp Arslan now seizes on the beating of his sister to call for war. He invades, and he manages to reduce the Karakhanid realm to his vassalage, a client state. Now you have the unification of Iran and Turan under one single empire. And with that comes Nizam al-Mulk's reforms. Nizam al-Mulk is someone who takes on after Alp Arslan, and he manages to diffuse the situation such that a civil war doesn't take place. And Alp Arslan's son, Malik Shah, really becomes his protege, his kind of king in waiting, while he himself rules as de facto sovereign. He becomes not just a powerful vizier, but he becomes a visionary for the state. He, in order to establish a bureaucratic and administrative kind of structure for the state, he reforms the religious as well as the bureaucratic and even social setting of the empire. He starts to distribute iqta. Iqta will be one of the most important kind of institutions in the Islamic world, and to this day, it is a very important institution. It's usually now called waqf. It's a religious endowment. In this period, the way he uses it is, we have this kind of Turcoman nomadic element that is very unruly. How do we integrate these Turcoman emirs into an imperial bureaucracy? The way he does it is he sets out a tax system, a bureaucracy that, at least nominally, has control over the entirety of the empire, but he carves out little parcels of territory, little fiefdoms, where he settles these Turcoman emirs and says, this is your fiefdom. 50%, 70%, or 100% sometimes of the revenues generated in this province and collected by our bureaucrats will go into your coffers. So you hold it as your private fiefdom, and you have certain privileges here outside of the revenues that are assigned to you. So he manages in a very sophisticated way to integrate them into the imperial structure. And at the same time, he is a patron of the Sunni school of thought. So he sets up the madrasas, and he wants to integrate the ulama through patronage into the Seljuk system as well. He rationalizes the bureaucracy, and he has a very elaborate kind of imperial structure. And you can see just how big the Seljuk Empire becomes in this period. It reaches down, and even Mecca and Medina, the two holy sites, come under his control, all the way from the Eastern Mediterranean into Syria and the Levant, and the South Caucasus, Iran, Khorasan, as well as the Karakhanid realm beyond the Oxus. This is giving credence to that kind of notion, that idea. When the Caliph crowns the Seljuk emirs, he crowns them with Taj Khosravi, the Khosroid crown. He gives them 7 robes of honor to signify the 7 climes of the world. In old Iranian cosmology, the notion that the entire world is made up of 7 different climes. Malik al-Mashriq wal-Maghrib. Here you can see how that claim to power is given credence. But of course, eventually, the cycle of civil war breaks down the empire. Nizam ul-Mulk dies, and this element, this nefarious element of when the Sultan dies, anyone in the extended clan of the Seljuks can make a bid for power. It used to be in the scholarship, there used to be this idea that, well, this is actually a good process, because what does it mean? It means the most intelligent and capable man through competition will rise to the top and be able to impose his will. So it guarantees a capable ruler. This is one of the dumbest ideas that I've come across, and I'll tell you why. Look at it from the perspective of the Turkmen emirs. Are you going to go with candidate A or candidate B? Candidate A is a man in his prime. He is intelligent. He is a hard negotiator. He's really cut out for kingship, which means you're going to get a very overbearing, strong king. Or you have candidate B, his 2-year-old brother. I'm going to go with candidate B, because when he becomes sultan, really, the people becoming sultan is me and my Turkmen emir friends, not candidate A. And this is something that you see constantly in Seljuk history. Actually, the more becoming candidate is the one to be eliminated, because the Turkmen emirs do not want him. They want the weaker candidate who they can control. And it becomes a constant struggle between the Turkmen emirs on which candidate do we get to put on the throne. And this factionalism really tears the empire apart at the seams. I'm just going to finish off with one of these Turkmen emirs' inscriptions, in which you can see that they're starting to make claims to universal authority themselves. So not only are they de facto decoupling from the Seljuk imperial authority, now they're articulating claims in and of themselves. The victorious Nuruddin over many kings and mighty sultans, the world Khosrow of Iran, the emir of the 2 Iraqs, the sovereign of the Levant. There's no notion that he's subject to anyone's authority. And I think there we will end it, and we will come back much later on to discuss the Timurids, another Turco-Mongol entity.